I moved to that cabin in the Boundary Waters 3 years ago, seeking nothing more than silence. My name is Michael Harrison, and I was 28 when I made the decision to leave everything behind. The city had drained something essential from me, and I found myself craving the kind of solitude that only the deep wilderness could provide. The cabin I rented sat on the shore of a nameless lake, accessible only by a winding dirt road that disappeared into the forest for miles. The place was perfect for someone who wanted to vanish. Built in the 1960s by a trapper who had long since passed away, it was sturdy but simple. One room with a stone fireplace, a small kitchen area, and a loft where I slept. The nearest neighbor was 40 miles away, and cell phone service was non-existent. I had a satellite phone for emergencies, solar panels for minimal electricity, and a wood-burning stove that kept me warm through the brutal Minnesota winters. My days followed a rhythm as old as humanity itself. I woke with the sun, chopped wood, tended a small garden during the warmer months, and fished the lake when the ice wasn't too thick. I read books by lamplight, wrote in journals, and listened to the forest breathe around me. It was exactly what I had been searching for, a life stripped down to its essential elements, free from the constant noise and demands of modern existence. The forest was my companion, my teacher, and my protector. I learned to read its moods, like an old married couple learns to read each other's silences. I knew when storms were coming by, the way the birds fell silent, and the trees seemed to hold their breath. I could tell the difference between the footsteps of a deer and those of a black bear by the rhythm and weight of their movement on the forest floor. In autumn, the woods transformed into something almost magical. The maples turned brilliant red, the birches gleamed gold, and the air carried the sweet scent of decomposing leaves and the crisp promise of winter. I would spend hours walking the old logging trails, collecting mushrooms and berries, photographing the way light filtered through the canopy, and simply existing in harmony with the natural world around me. Winter brought a different kind of beauty, harsh but magnificent. Snow would pile 3 feet deep around the cabin, and temperatures would drop to 20 below zero on the coldest nights. The lake would freeze solid, creating a highway of ice that stretched to the horizon. On clear nights, the aurora borealis would dance across the sky in sheets of green and purple light, and I would stand outside, despite the cold, mesmerized by the cosmic display. It was during my second winter that things began to change. At first, I noticed small details that seemed slightly off. Animal tracks that appeared overnight in patterns that didn't make sense. Sounds in the forest that I couldn't identify, even after 2 years of learning its voice, a feeling of being watched that would creep over me when I was chopping wood or hauling water from the lake. I told myself it was cabin fever, the psychological pressure that comes from months of isolation. Every person who spends extended time alone in the wilderness experiences it to some degree. The mind begins to play tricks, to see patterns and meanings where none exist. I had read about it extensively before coming to the forest, and I thought I was prepared for its effects. But these weren't hallucinations or paranoid delusions. The signs were too consistent, too real. Branches broken at shoulder height where no animal could have reached them. Scratches carved deep into tree bark in deliberate patterns that looked almost like symbols. Footprints in the snow that were human-like, but wrong somehow, too long and narrow, with claw marks at the tips. The first time I saw it clearly was on a February morning when the temperature had dropped to 30 below. I was splitting wood behind the cabin, my breath forming clouds in the frigid air, when I felt that familiar sensation of being observed. I looked up from my work and scanned the tree line, expecting to see a deer or perhaps a curious wolf. Instead, I saw something that made my blood freeze in my veins. Standing at the edge of the clearing, partially hidden behind a massive pine tree, was a figure that defied every rational explanation my mind tried to construct. It stood at least 8 feet tall, gaunt to the point of skeletal emaciation, with skin that appeared grey and stretched tight over prominent bones. Its limbs were impossibly long and thin, ending in hands that seemed more like talons, but it was the face that truly unsettled me, elongated and hollow-cheeked, with eyes that glowed with an intelligence that was unmistakably ancient and aware. For several heartbeats, we simply stared at each other across the snow-covered clearing. I felt my rational mind struggling to process what I was seeing, cycling through explanations and finding each one inadequate. This couldn't be a person, not with those proportions and that otherworldly stillness. It couldn't be an animal, not with that posture and those eyes that seemed to look directly into my soul. Then, without warning, it stepped back into the forest and vanished as silently as it had appeared. I stood there for a long time afterward, my axe forgotten in my hands, staring at the spot where it had been. Part of me wondered if I had imagined the entire encounter, if the isolation and cold had finally pushed my mind beyond the boundaries of reality. But I could still feel the weight of its gaze, still see those ancient eyes burned into my memory with perfect clarity. That night, I barely slept. I lay in my loft, listening to every sound the cabin made as it settled, every whisper of wind through the trees, every crack of ice on the lake. I found myself thinking about the old stories I had heard growing up, tales told around campfires about creatures that inhabited the deep woods, stories I had always dismissed as folklore and superstition. The Ojibwe people, who had lived in these forests for thousands of years before European settlers arrived, had many names for the spirits that dwelt among the trees. Some were benevolent, guardians of the natural world who could guide lost travelers to safety. Others were to be feared and avoided at all costs. And then there were those that existed somewhere between the two extremes, neither wholly good nor entirely evil, but simply other. Over the following days, I began to research everything I could find about the legends of the northern forests. My small collection of books included several volumes on Native American mythology and folklore, and I devoured them with an intensity I hadn't felt since my college years. The more I read, the more convinced I became that what I had seen was not a product of my imagination. The descriptions varied from tribe to tribe, but certain elements remained consistent across all the stories. A creature of immense height and skeletal appearance, intelligence that surpassed human understanding, a connection to the forest so deep that it seemed to be woven from the very essence of the wilderness itself, and always, the warning that these beings were not to be approached lightly. But despite the warnings, I found myself drawn to the possibility of another encounter. The loneliness I had thought I was content with suddenly felt like a weight pressing down on my chest. The silence I had craved now seemed oppressive and empty. For the first time since arriving at the cabin, I realized how desperately I missed meaningful conversation, intellectual connection, the simple pleasure of sharing ideas with another conscious being. 3 days after the first sighting, I made a decision that would change the course of my life forever. I gathered my courage, put on my warmest clothing, and walked deliberately to the spot where the creature had appeared. I stood there in the morning light, feeling foolish and terrified in equal measure, and spoke aloud to the empty forest. "I know you're out there," I said, my voice sounding strange and small in the vast silence. "I know you're watching me. I don't mean any harm. I'm just alone. And I think maybe you are too." The words hung in the air for several minutes, absorbed by the snow and the trees and the infinite patience of the wilderness. I was about to give up and return to the cabin when I heard it, a sound like wind through dry leaves, but somehow shaped and purposeful. "You speak to shadows and call them real," came the voice, neither male nor female, but something altogether other. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, carried on the cold air like the whisper of ancient secrets. "What makes you think the shadows wish to speak back?" I turned slowly, my heart hammering against my ribs, and saw the creature standing no more than 20 feet away. In daylight, it was even more extraordinary than I had remembered. Its skin was the color of winter bark, marked with patterns that might have been scars or tattoos, or simply the natural texture of something not quite flesh. It moved with a fluid grace that made me think of smoke or water, present and substantial, but somehow not entirely bound by the same physical laws that governed my own existence. "Because," I said, surprised by the steadiness of my own voice, "I've been alone for 2 years, and I think you've been alone much longer than that." The creature tilted its head, studying me with those luminous eyes. Up close, I could see that they were not simply glowing, but seemed to contain depths that stretched beyond the physical, like looking into pools of starlight. "Loneliness," it said, the word carrying layers of meaning I could only begin to comprehend. "A human concept. We do not experience time as you do, small one. What is loneliness to a being that has watched forests grow and die and grow again? What is solitude to one who carries the memories of 1,000 seasons?" I found myself taking a step closer, drawn by the musical quality of its voice and the profound sadness that seemed to underlie every word. "Then why are you here? Why show yourself to me?" The creature was silent for a long moment, and I watched its expression shift in subtle ways that suggested deep thought. When it finally spoke, there was something almost vulnerable in its tone. "You do not fear me," it observed. "You do not run or scream or make the signs your ancestors made to ward off the spirits of the forest. You simply stand here and speak, as if I were no different from yourself." "Should I be afraid?" I asked, genuinely curious rather than challenging. "Most would be. Most are. Your kind has forgotten how to see us truly, how to recognize what we are beyond the stories they tell to frighten children. They have made us into monsters in their tales, creatures of hunger and violence. But those stories are—" It paused, searching for the right word. "Incomplete." I spent the next hour in conversation with this being that should not have existed, discussing topics that ranged from the migration patterns of caribou to the philosophical implications of consciousness. Its knowledge of the natural world was encyclopedic, accumulated over centuries of careful observation and interaction with every aspect of the forest ecosystem. But what struck me most was its profound loneliness, a sadness so deep and ancient that it seemed to permeate the very air around us. "My people called your kind Wendigo," it said, as our first conversation drew to a close. "But that word has been corrupted by your stories, twisted into something it was never meant to be. We are not cannibals, driven mad by hunger. We are guardians, watchers, the memory keepers of the wild places. But the wild places grow smaller with each passing year, and there are fewer and fewer of us left to remember." As winter gradually gave way to spring, our encounters became more frequent. The creature, who told me its name, was something I could never properly pronounce, but sounded like wind through pine needles, would appear at seemingly random intervals. Sometimes it would emerge from the forest while I was fishing, settling onto the shore with movements that barely disturbed the pebbles beneath its feet. Other times I would find it waiting by my cabin in the early morning, patient and still as a statue until I acknowledged its presence. Our conversations covered an incredible range of topics, but I began to notice certain recurring themes. The creature spoke often of balance, of the delicate interconnections that held the natural world together. It described ecological relationships with a depth of understanding that put my college biology courses to shame, explaining how the migration of a single species of butterfly could affect the breeding patterns of birds hundreds of miles away, how the root systems of trees communicated chemical signals that allowed entire forests to coordinate their responses to drought or disease. Your kind sees nature as a collection of separate things, it told me one afternoon as we watched a pair of loons diving for fish in the lake. Trees, water, animals, insects, all individual entities competing for resources. But this is not how the world works. Everything is connected. Everything is in conversation. The trees speak to the soil speaks to the water speaks to the sky. We are all part of the same living system, the same great organism. I found myself learning not just facts, but entirely new ways of perceiving the world around me. The creature taught me to read the subtle signs that indicated the health of the forest, the color and texture of moss on tree bark, the patterns of lichen growth on rocks, the behavior of insects and small mammals that most people never notice. Under its guidance, I began to see the woods not as a backdrop for my solitude, but as a complex, living entity with its own intelligence and consciousness. "Watch the ravens," it said during one of our early spring walks along the lake shore. "They are the storytellers of the forest. They remember everything, and they share their knowledge with those who know how to listen." I learned to pay attention to the calls and behaviors of the ravens that nested in the tall pines around my cabin. The creature was right. They seemed to be engaged in constant communication, not just with each other, but with the entire forest community. Their warnings about approaching storms were more accurate than any weather forecast, and their excited chatter often preceded the arrival of other animals in the area. But it was during a conversation in late April, as the ice was breaking up on the lake and the first green shoots were pushing through the forest floor, that the creature shared something that fundamentally changed my understanding of what it meant to be human. We had been discussing the concept of progress, sparked by my observation that the previous winter had been warmer than usual, part of a trend that even reached this remote corner of the wilderness. The creature listened patiently as I explained what I understood about climate change, about industrial emissions and rising sea levels, and the political battles being fought over environmental policy in the outside world. When I finished, it was quiet for a long time, staring out across the water with those ancient eyes. Finally, it turned to look at me directly, and I felt the full weight of its attention like a physical presence. "You want to know what I see when I look at your species," it said, and it wasn't really a question. I nodded, though part of me wasn't sure I wanted to hear the answer. "I see children playing with fire in a room full of gasoline," it said quietly. "I see a species so young, so new to consciousness, that you still think in terms of individual survival rather than collective wisdom. You have the tools to reshape the world, but you lack the maturity to understand the consequences of using them." The words hit me like a physical blow, not because they were cruel, but because they carried the weight of absolute truth. I had spent 2 years running from the complexity and chaos of modern civilization, seeking peace in the simplicity of survival and solitude. But I had never really considered the bigger picture, the way my own species was moving through the world like a force of nature that had lost touch with its own purpose. "We were not always as we are now," the creature continued, its voice taking on an almost hypnotic quality. "There was a time not so very long ago, in the great span of things, when your people lived in harmony with the patterns that govern all life. They understood that taking from the earth required giving back, that the health of the human community depended on the health of the larger community of all living things." It gestured toward the forest around us, now beginning to show the fresh green of new growth. "Your ancestors knew how to listen to the voice of the land, how to read the signs that would tell them when to plant and when to harvest, when to move and when to stay, when to take and when to leave alone. They knew that they were not separate from nature, but part of it, subject to the same laws and cycles that governed everything else. Over the following weeks, as spring deepened into early summer, the creature shared more of its observations about human nature and the trajectory of our civilization. Its perspective was both fascinating and deeply troubling, offering insights that came from watching our species develop over the span of centuries. "You have forgotten how to be still," it said during one of our evening conversations, as the sun set behind the trees and painted the lake in shades of gold and crimson. "Your minds are always moving, always consuming new information, new stimulation. But wisdom does not come from accumulating knowledge. Wisdom comes from sitting quietly and allowing the knowledge you already have to settle into understanding." I thought about my own life before coming to the cabin, the constant stream of emails and news updates and social media notifications that had filled every quiet moment. Even my decision to retreat to the wilderness had been driven by a kind of restless urgency, a need to escape rather than a genuine desire to find peace. "Your technology advances faster than your wisdom," the creature continued. "Each generation develops tools more powerful than anything their ancestors could have imagined. But they do not develop the judgment to use those tools wisely. It is like giving explosives to infants." The analogy was harsh, but I couldn't deny its accuracy. I had worked in software development before my retreat to the forest, and I had seen firsthand how new technologies were deployed with little consideration for their long-term consequences. The focus was always on what was possible, never on what was advisable. "Tell me about the cities," the creature said one day, catching me off guard. "Tell me what it feels like to live surrounded by millions of your own kind, cut off from the earth and sky." I tried to describe the urban experience, the energy and excitement of being part of something larger than yourself, the convenience of having everything you needed within walking distance, the cultural richness that came from diversity and density. But as I spoke, I found myself also describing the loneliness that existed in crowds, the way you could be surrounded by people and still feel completely alone. "Your cities are like hives," the creature observed, "each individual performing their assigned function, all working toward some collective goal that none of them fully understands. But unlike the bees or the ants, your individuals have consciousness, have the capacity for independent thought and choice. This creates a conflict that tears at the soul, the need to belong to something larger than yourself, but also the need to maintain your individual identity and autonomy." It was during one of these conversations about human nature that the creature shared what would prove to be the most unsettling observation of all. We were discussing the concept of legacy, the human need to leave something meaningful behind after death. I had mentioned my own struggle with the question of purpose, my uncertainty about whether my retreat to the wilderness was an act of courage or cowardice. The creature listened thoughtfully, then asked a question that made my blood run cold. "What do you think will happen to your species when the resources run out?" The question hung in the air between us like a challenge. I had read about resource depletion, about peak oil and water scarcity and the competition for rare earth metals. But I had always assumed that human ingenuity would find solutions, that technology would provide alternatives before we reached any real crisis point. "You assume that your intelligence will save you?" the creature said, reading the expression on my face. "But intelligence without wisdom is not salvation, it is catastrophe. Your species excels at solving individual problems, but you fail to see how those solutions create larger problems down the road." It gestured toward the forest around us, now lush with summer growth. "Every ecosystem has natural limits, natural boundaries that prevent any one species from growing beyond what the environment can support. When those limits are exceeded, the system corrects itself, sometimes gently, through adaptation and migration, sometimes harshly, through famine and disease and death." I felt a chill despite the warm summer air. Are you saying that humans are approaching our natural limits? I am saying that your species has already exceeded them. The creature replied with a sadness that seemed to encompass the entire world. You have been living beyond your means for decades now, borrowing against the future to fund the present, and like all debts, eventually it must be paid. The creature went on to describe what it had observed during its long existence, the acceleration of environmental destruction over the past century. The way human population and consumption had grown exponentially, while the Earth's capacity to support that growth had remained constant. It spoke of forests that had disappeared within its lifetime, of rivers that had been poisoned beyond recovery, of animal species that had vanished forever. The question is not whether the correction will come, it said quietly. The question is whether your species will learn from it or be consumed by it. We sat in silence for a long time after that, watching the sun sink behind the trees and listening to the evening sounds of the forest coming alive. I felt overwhelmed by the weight of what the creature had shared with me, by the implications of viewing human civilization from such a vast temporal perspective. "Why are you telling me this?" I finally asked. "What do you expect me to do with this knowledge?" The creature turned to look at me, and for a moment I saw something in its ancient eyes that might have been hope. "Because you chose to listen," it said simply. "Because you stepped away from the noise and confusion of your modern world and remembered how to be still. Because in all my centuries of watching your kind, you are one of the few who has sought to understand rather than to judge or exploit or destroy." As summer progressed toward autumn, our conversations took on a different quality. The creature began to share not just its observations about humanity, but its memories of what the world had been like before industrial civilization transformed it. It described forests that stretched from horizon to horizon, rivers so clean you could see the bottom at depths of 20 feet, skies so clear that the Milky Way blazed like a river of stars even on summer nights. "Your ancestors lived in a world of abundance," it told me during one particularly poignant conversation. "Not the false abundance of your modern economy, built on debt and exploitation, but true abundance. The abundance that comes from living in harmony with natural cycles, from taking only what you need and giving back more than you take." It painted word pictures of Native American communities that had lived in these very forests for thousands of years, developing sophisticated systems of resource management that allowed them to thrive without depleting the environment that supported them. It described seasonal migrations that followed the rhythms of animal movements and plant growth, ceremonies and rituals that reinforce the understanding of human dependence on the natural world. "They knew how to read the great book of the earth," the creature said. "They could look at the behavior of animals and the growth patterns of plants and know what the weather would be months in advance. They could manage fires to encourage the growth of useful species and discourage harmful ones. They could take from the forest without damaging it, hunt without depleting animal populations, live as part of the ecosystem rather than apart from it." But as autumn deepened and the first frosts began to touch the forest, I sensed a change in the creature's demeanor. It became more distant, more melancholy, as if the approaching winter was bringing with it a sadness too deep for words. Our conversations became shorter and less frequent, and sometimes I would find it standing at the edge of the clearing, staring into the distance, as if listening to sounds I could not hear. "The balance is shifting," it told me during what I sensed would be one of our final conversations. "I can feel it in the movement of the earth, in the patterns of the stars, in the dreams of the animals. Change is coming, change like your species has never experienced. The question is whether enough of you will remember how to listen, how to adapt, how to find your way back to harmony with the forces that sustain all life." I wanted to ask more questions, to understand what exactly the creature was sensing and what it meant for the future, but something in its manner discouraged me from pressing for details. Instead, I found myself thinking about my own future, about what I would do with the knowledge and perspective I had gained during these extraordinary months. "Will I see you again?" I asked, as the creature prepared to melt back into the forest from which it had emerged. It turned back to look at me one last time, and I saw in its expression a combination of ancient wisdom and profound sadness that took my breath away. "You will carry me with you always," it said softly. "In every tree you see, in every wild creature you encounter, in every moment of silence you allow yourself to experience. The voice of the wilderness is never truly gone. It only waits for those who remember how to listen." And then it was gone, disappearing into the shadows between the trees as silently and completely as if it had never existed at all. The final weeks before winter fell hard and fast, and I found myself spending more and more time thinking about the creature's words and what they meant for my own life. I had come to the wilderness seeking solitude and simplicity, but I had discovered something much more profound. A perspective that stretched beyond individual human concerns to encompass the vast, interconnected web of relationships that sustained all life on Earth. As the snows began to fall and the lake started to freeze, I made a decision that surprised even myself. I would return to the world I had fled, but I would return changed, carrying with me the wisdom and perspective that the creature had shared. I could not single-handedly solve the crisis that faced human civilization, but I could add my voice to those who were calling for a different way of living, a different relationship with the natural world. I spent my final weeks at the cabin, writing down everything I could remember of my conversations with the creature, trying to capture not just its words, but the deeper truths they pointed toward. I wrote about the interconnectedness of all living systems, about the false separation between human civilization and the natural world, about the urgent need for a transformation in consciousness that would allow our species to find its way back to balance and sustainability. When spring finally came and the ice began to break up on the lake, I packed my few belongings and prepared to leave the place that had become my home for 3 years. As I loaded my truck for the long drive back to civilization, I felt the weight of responsibility settling on my shoulders like a physical presence. I had been given a gift beyond measure, the opportunity to see the world through eyes infinitely older and wiser than my own, to understand the true scope of the crisis facing our species and the planet that sustained us. But with that gift came an obligation. The obligation to share what I had learned, to add my voice to the chorus of those calling for change, to live in a way that honored the wisdom I had been given. As I drove away from the cabin for the last time, I found myself thinking about the creature's final words, about the voice of the wilderness that waits for those who remember how to listen. I realized that I would spend the rest of my life learning how to be that kind of listener, how to carry the stillness and awareness I had cultivated in the forest into the noise and chaos of the modern world. The creature had shown me that the crisis facing humanity was not just environmental or economic or political, it was fundamentally spiritual. It was a crisis of disconnection, of forgetting our place in the larger community of life, of losing touch with the wisdom that could guide us back to balance and harmony. But it had also shown me that this disconnection was not inevitable, that it was possible for human beings to remember their true nature and their proper relationship with the world that sustained them. The solution would not come from technology or politics or economics alone, but from a fundamental transformation in consciousness, a remembering of what it meant to be truly human. Now, sitting here in my small apartment in Minneapolis, months after leaving the cabin, I find myself struggling to put into words the full impact of those conversations with the creature that called itself by a name like wind through pine needles. The urban environment feels simultaneously familiar and alien, a human construct that seems increasingly fragile when viewed against the vast timescales and natural cycles I learned to perceive during my time in the wilderness. Every day I am confronted by evidence of what the creature described. The restless urgency that drives modern life, the endless consumption of resources and information, the disconnection from natural rhythms and cycles. I see it in the faces of people hurrying past on the sidewalks, in the constant stream of news about environmental disasters and social conflicts, in my own struggle to maintain the peace and clarity I found in the forest. But I also see signs of hope, evidence that more and more people are beginning to question the assumptions that have guided human civilization for the past several centuries. I see young people choosing to live more simply, to prioritize sustainability over convenience, to seek meaning and connection rather than just material success. I see communities coming together to create local food systems, renewable energy networks, and decision-making processes that take into account the welfare of future generations. Most importantly, I see individuals who are learning how to listen to the voices of indigenous elders who never forgot the old ways, to the warnings of scientists who study climate and ecology, to the subtle signals from the natural world that indicate when human activities are moving too far out of balance. The creature's message was ultimately one of both warning and hope. Warning about the consequences of continuing on our current path, but hope that human consciousness was capable of the transformation necessary to avoid catastrophe. It had chosen to share its perspective with me, not because I was special or chosen, but because I had demonstrated the willingness to step outside the assumptions of my culture and listen to voices that had been marginalized or forgotten. I think often about the creature's description of humans as children playing with fire in a room full of gasoline. The image is terrifying in its accuracy, but it also points toward a solution. Children can learn, can grow, can develop the wisdom necessary to handle powerful tools responsibly. The question is whether we have enough time, whether the consequences of our past mistakes will overwhelm us before we can mature into the kind of species capable of living in harmony with the forces that sustain all life. In my darkest moments, I remember the creature's ancient sadness, its sense of watching a beautiful and complex world being systematically destroyed by a species too young and reckless to understand what it was losing. But in my moments of hope, I remember its final words about the voice of the wilderness that waits for those who remember how to listen. The conversation with the creature that lasted 4 hours took place on a late summer evening, as we sat by the shore of the lake watching the stars emerge in a sky still touched with the last light of sunset. It was during this conversation that the creature shared its most profound and unsettling insights about human nature and the future of our species. "You ask me what I see when I look at humanity," it had said, settling into the patient stillness that characterized all our interactions. "You want to understand how your kind appears to eyes that have watched the rise and fall of civilizations, that have seen the patterns that repeat across centuries and millennia." I had nodded, sensing that this would be different from our earlier discussions, that the creature was preparing to share something it had perhaps never put into words before. "Your species stands at a crossroads," it continued, its voice taking on an almost ceremonial quality. "You have developed the power to reshape the world according to your desires, but you have not yet developed the wisdom to understand what kinds of desires are worth pursuing. You are like an adolescent who has suddenly grown to adult size and strength, but still thinks with the mind of a child." The analogy struck me with the force of revelation. I thought about the way teenagers often struggled with the gap between their physical capabilities and their emotional maturity. how they could cause tremendous damage without intending to, how they needed guidance and boundaries until their judgment caught up with their power. The tragedy, the creature went on, is that your species has all the knowledge it needs to live sustainably, to create systems that enhance rather than degrade the health of the planet. Your scientists understand ecology and climate and renewable energy. Your philosophers have written extensively about ethics and responsibility and the conditions necessary for human flourishing. Your spiritual traditions contain profound wisdom about living in harmony with natural cycles and forces. I felt a familiar weight settling in my chest, the same feeling I had experienced many times during our conversations when the creature's observations forced me to confront uncomfortable truths about my own species. Then why, I asked, do we continue to move in the opposite direction? Why do we keep choosing short-term gain over long-term sustainability, individual profit over collective welfare? The creature was quiet for a long moment, and I could sense it choosing its words carefully. Because your systems of organization have become disconnected from the wisdom of individuals, it finally said. Your governments, your corporations, your economic systems, they operate according to their own internal logic, their own imperatives for growth and competition and control. They have become like living entities with their own survival instincts, and those instincts often conflict with the welfare of the humans they supposedly serve. This was a perspective I had never considered, the idea that human institutions might have evolved beyond human control, might have developed their own evolutionary pressures that pushed them toward behaviors that were ultimately destructive to their creators. Your economic system, for example, the creature continued, requires constant growth to remain stable. But constant growth is impossible in a finite world. Eventually, any system based on exponential expansion must collapse when it encounters the limits of its environment. Your ancestors understood this intuitively. They developed cultural practices and belief systems that prevented any individual or group from accumulating resources beyond what the community could sustainably provide. I thought about the indigenous societies the creature had described, with their sophisticated systems for managing common resources and preventing the kind of inequality that characterized modern civilization. I thought about the potlatch ceremonies of Pacific Northwest tribes, where status was determined not by how much wealth you could accumulate, but by how much you could give away. The most terrifying thing, the creature said, and I could hear genuine fear in its voice for the first time since our conversations had begun, is that your species knows all of this. Your best thinkers have identified the problems, analyzed their causes, and proposed solutions. But the systems you have created are too powerful, too entrenched, too resistant to change. It's like watching someone die of a disease for which the cure is known but cannot be administered because the patient's body rejects the medicine. We sat in silence for a while, listening to the gentle lapping of waves against the shore and the distant call of a loon somewhere across the lake. I felt overwhelmed by the scope of what the creature was describing, by the sense that humanity was trapped in patterns too large and complex for any individual to change. But there is hope, the creature said suddenly, as if reading my thoughts. There is always hope, as long as consciousness exists, as long as beings are capable of learning and growth and transformation. Your species has survived ice ages and volcanic winters, and plagues that killed vast portions of the population. You have shown remarkable resilience and adaptability when faced with existential threats. It turned to look at me directly, and I felt the full force of its ancient attention. The question is whether you can adapt quickly enough this time. The changes that are coming will happen faster than anything your species has experienced in recorded history. Climate systems that have been stable for thousands of years are already beginning to shift. Economic systems that have supported billions of people are showing signs of instability. Social and political structures are under stress that may soon exceed their breaking points. The creature went on to describe what it sensed coming, not a single catastrophic event, but a cascade of interconnected crises that would force humanity to either evolve rapidly or face the kind of population collapse that had ended previous civilizations. Resource depletion would lead to economic instability, which would lead to social unrest, which would make it even harder to respond effectively to environmental challenges. "Your species will face a choice," it said quietly. "You can cling to the systems and beliefs that brought you to this point, in which case you will likely experience the same fate as every other species that has exceeded its environmental limits. Or you can let go of those systems and beliefs and learn to live within the boundaries that the planet sets for you." I asked the creature what it thought would determine which path humanity would take, what factors would tip the balance toward adaptation rather than collapse. "The quality of your leadership," it replied without hesitation. "Not your political leaders. They are too constrained by the systems they operate within to make the changes that are necessary. I mean the moral and spiritual leaders, the teachers and artists and storytellers who shape how people think about meaning and purpose and possibility." This surprised me. I had expected the creature to emphasize technology or policy or some other practical consideration. "Ideas are the most powerful force in the universe," the creature explained. "Physical forces can move matter, but ideas can move consciousness. And consciousness is what determines how physical forces are directed and used. The stories that people tell themselves about who they are and what is possible, those stories literally create the world." The creature described how every major transformation in human history had begun with new ideas, new ways of thinking about fundamental questions. The agricultural revolution had required new concepts of time and planning and relationship to the land. The scientific revolution had required new methods of observation and hypothesis testing. The industrial revolution had required new understanding of energy and mechanical systems. The transformation that is coming will require new ideas about what it means to be human, about your relationship to the natural world, about the purpose and meaning of civilization itself, it said. "These ideas already exist in fragments, in indigenous wisdom traditions, in ecological science, in spiritual practices that emphasize interconnection and balance. But they have not yet coalesced into a coherent worldview that can compete with the dominant narrative of your culture." As our 4-hour conversation drew toward its close, the creature shared one final observation that has stayed with me through all the months since I left the wilderness. "Your species has a gift that makes you unique among all the creatures I have known," it said, its voice carrying a warmth that I had not heard before. "You have the capacity for love that transcends biological programming, love that extends beyond your immediate family or tribe to embrace the entire community of life. When humans operate from that kind of love, they are capable of extraordinary wisdom and generosity and creativity." The creature gestured toward the forest around us, now invisible in the darkness, but alive with the sounds of nocturnal creatures beginning their nightly activities. "This is what will save you, if anything can," it continued. "Not your technology or your intelligence or your adaptability, remarkable though those qualities are. It will be your capacity to love something larger than yourselves, to make sacrifices for the welfare of beings you will never meet, to find meaning and joy in serving the greater good rather than just pursuing individual advantage." I felt tears on my cheeks as the creature spoke these words, though I could not have said exactly why. Perhaps it was relief at hearing something hopeful after hours of devastating analysis. Perhaps it was recognition of a truth that I had sensed, but never been able to articulate. Or perhaps it was simply the profound beauty of being seen so clearly and compassionately by a consciousness so different from my own. "Will we make it?" I asked, the question that had been building in me throughout our entire conversation. "Will humanity find its way through the crisis that's coming?" The creature was quiet for so long that I began to think it would not answer. Finally, it spoke, its words barely audible above the gentle sounds of the lake. "I do not know," it said simply, "but I know that you have the capacity to make it, whether you will choose to use that capacity. That is the great question of your time." And with those words, our 4-hour conversation came to an end. The creature rose from where it had been sitting and moved toward the tree line, pausing at the edge of the clearing to look back at me one final time. "Remember," it said, its voice already fading into the night sounds of the forest. "The voice of the wilderness is never truly gone. It waits for those who remember how to listen." The months since that conversation have been a time of profound integration for me, a slow process of understanding how to carry the creature's wisdom into a life lived among my own kind. I have struggled with the weight of what I learned, with the sense of responsibility that comes from being given such a comprehensive view of humanity's situation. Sometimes I feel paralyzed by the scope of the challenges we face, by the awareness of how deeply our problems are rooted in the fundamental structures of modern civilization. The creature's analysis was both brilliant and terrifying in its clarity, leaving little room for the comfortable illusions that make daily life bearable for most people. But I have also found strength in the creature's final words about humanity's capacity for love and transformation. I have begun to see evidence of that capacity everywhere, in the young people who are choosing to dedicate their lives to environmental protection, in the communities that are experimenting with new forms of economic organization, in the individuals who are quietly learning to live more simply and sustainably. Most importantly, I've begun to understand my own role in the great transformation that the creature described. I may not be a political leader or a famous scientist or an influential artist, but I am a storyteller. And stories, as the creature reminded me, are among the most powerful forces in the universe. This is why I am sharing this account, why I am risking the skepticism and disbelief that will inevitably greet any tale of conversation with a being that should not exist. Because the creature's message needs to be heard, needs to become part of the great conversation that humanity is having about its future and its relationship to the planet that sustains us. The Wendigo, though that word, as the creature pointed out, carries connotations that distort its true nature, offered me a perspective that no human teacher could provide. It showed me our species as we appear to consciousness that operates on geological timescales, that has watched the rise and fall of countless civilizations, that understands the deep patterns that govern the relationship between intelligence and wisdom. The warning it shared was stark. Humanity has developed the power to reshape the world, but lacks the maturity to use that power wisely. We are like children with weapons of tremendous destructive potential, stumbling toward catastrophes that our ancestors could never have imagined. But the message was not one of despair. It was a call to awakening, an invitation to step into our full potential as a species capable of love and wisdom and conscious cooperation with the forces that sustain all life. The creature had chosen to share its perspective not because our situation was hopeless, but because it still believed in our capacity for transformation. As I finish writing this account, I'm acutely aware that words can only capture a fraction of what I experienced during those months of conversation with a being that embodied the consciousness of the wilderness itself. The creature's presence was as important as its words, the sense of being in contact with intelligence that operated according to principles utterly different from human thought processes. But I hope that even this incomplete account might serve its purpose, to add one more voice to the growing chorus of those calling for a fundamental shift in how our species understands itself and its role in the web of relationships that constitutes life on Earth. The creature's message was ultimately simple, even if its implications are staggering. We must learn to listen to the voice of the wilderness, both around us and within us, if we are to find our way back to balance and sustainability. The conversation that lasted 4 hours has been continuing in my mind and heart for all the months since I left the cabin. Every day brings new confirmation of the creature's analysis, new evidence of both the crisis we face and our capacity to respond to it with wisdom and love. The future remains unwritten, the great question of our time still unanswered. But I know now that the answer lies not in our technologies or our institutions or our ideologies, but in our willingness to remember what the creature called our gift for love that transcends biological programming. It lies in our capacity to find meaning and purpose in service to something larger than ourselves, to make choices based on wisdom rather than fear, to listen to voices that have been marginalized or forgotten in the rush toward a progress that may not be progress at all. The Wendigo spoke to me for 4 hours about what it saw when it looked at humanity with eyes that had witnessed the deep patterns of existence. What it said was terrifying in its clarity and beautiful in its compassion. But most importantly, what it said was true. And truth, however difficult, is always the beginning of transformation. In the end, perhaps that is the creature's greatest gift. The reminder that truth-telling is an act of love, that facing reality clearly is the first step toward changing it, that hope lies not in denial or false optimism, but in our willingness to see ourselves and our situation with the kind of ancient clarity that can only come from stepping outside our ordinary ways of thinking and feeling and being. The voice of the wilderness waits for those who remember how to listen. In our capacity to hear that voice, to integrate its wisdom into our individual and collective choices, lies whatever hope we have for navigating the challenges ahead. The conversation continues, and each of us must decide what role we will play in humanity's response to the most important question of our time. Whether we will mature quickly enough to handle the power we have given ourselves, or whether that power will ultimately destroy the very foundations of the civilization that created it.